culture you're looking at? Because like Eastern and Western philosophies are different.
Incredibly different. That was one thing that I came across in sort of the last 2 or 3 days in, I suppose, preparing for this, was the differences in sexual education between Eastern and Western countries. And I wrote it on my notes, you might have noticed, but what I came across was in Eastern countries and, you know, all throughout Europe, the sex education is completely knowledge and pleasure-based were the words that I kept coming across. Whereas here, as you mentioned, it's quite fear and guilt-based. Whereas, and I wrote down that it was a lot about, you know, you hear things about like, you know, don't get pregnant, it'll ruin your life. You know, don't get an STI, which obviously you don't want to. If you could choose, you don't want to get, but it's instills this fear in you.
Yeah.
Whereas all across Europe, and I mean, I've a lot of friends who grew up there. And just talking to them, they're incredibly more open about it than we are.
Open and liberal about it.
Completely open and liberal. And their education was about, this is a natural thing. You should welcome it. You should want it. You should know about it. And you learn about how it's going to actually impact you as you grow up, as opposed to be this terrible thing. I think the sex education, you nailed it. Is that something that can be changed quite quickly, or is it something that gradually...
Oh my God, if you're talking about the school curriculum of sex ed, it's a battlefield. I used to work as a sexual educator going to schools and teaching sex ed.
Did you really?
Yeah. And
that would have been really interesting.
It was so interesting. And there's a lot of red tape around like what we can talk to.
Yep.
And the thing that I didn't like, and one of the reasons that I actually like stopped working primarily with kids in schools, is because the schools have the ability to dictate what they do and don't want to be taught. So they could go through our curriculum and be like, we don't want anything to do with gay sex in there. We don't want anything to do with like trans people in there. Schools hated anal sex stuff, which I thought was, I don't know, just funny that kept coming up as well. They were like, don't say the word anal. And it's like, well, it's just part of sex though.
It's part of it, yeah.
Oh, like statistically, we know kids are doing it. So it's better to teach them about how to do it safely than to pretend it doesn't exist. And then people might be at high risks of like HIV, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. It's happening. So you may as well know about
happening.
It.
And there's the science backs that it is happening. You know, there's all of these amazing surveys that happen like every 5 years in terms of the behaviors of school kids and like their sexual behavior. Yeah. So it's so interesting. So just recently, like consent has just become mandated across all schools in Australia. So until 2022, like schools didn't have to teach consent. So
yeah, there was so what do you mean by mandated? But you mean so teaching?
Mandated. Yeah. So now legally all school curriculums from years 1 to 12 have to teach consent at whatever that level is.
Yep.
And it's different for year 12s and for year 1s, right? So in year 1s, you kind of look at it more so as it's teaching people what boundaries are. It's teaching people to respect other people.
To be able to say no.
To be able to say no and respect that. And then you go up to year 12 and you're talking about like sexual consent and things like the grey areas and nuances of sex and drugs and alcohol, for example. So it's different and layered depending on how old you are. And I think that there's definitely, it needs to be taught. It needs to be reframed depending on the age of the kids for sure. But yeah, like that's something that's just been mandated. So until recently, we never got access to what consent was. Like I didn't in school.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you mentioned that you brought in religion before, because for myself, I went to Sacred Heart, and
is that religious?
Maris, so Catholic, yeah. And our sex ed wasn't called sex ed; it was called Midiog, which stood for made in the image of God.
Oh God!
I know. I see your face. Yeah, so that's what sex ed was called.
So problematic.
Yeah, I know. So that's what it was called. And we were all like, we know it's sex ed. Like, just fucking call it sex ed.
Call a spade a spade.
Yeah, 100%. And they're like, no, it's not sex ed. And we're like, it's 100% sex ed.
Yeah.
But they would the way it was taught was it would blur sort of the biology of it with religious teachings. And to me, that started at year 7. So we didn't have that mentioned before year 7 or year 8 even, and to me that's too late.
So late.
And what I learned was that this sex education around the world, it starts way younger than that. It starts in, like you said, year 1 prep, and you learn those, even if they're just quite basic rudimentary concepts of just saying no, or this is your body, and these kind of things, which are obviously crucial. They start super early, and because it started so early, it's normalized. Because if you learn something how old are you in year 8? 14? 13?
Yeah.
Like by that point, you already have ideas about things and opinions. And if you start learning about it when you're 13, like no wonder you don't want to talk about it.
Oh my God, absolutely. You know, the average age for boys watching porn is 9. So if you're thinking about, in Australia. So if you're watching like young men getting access to watching things like porn when they're 9 years old, by 13, so much of that damage has been done if you're watching 100%. Porn so young. There was a study that was done where they did this sample study of, I think they maybe went through like a few hundred different porn sites, porn videos, and just kind of generalized and dot pointed what they found, and just kind of compared all of them. And they found that 97% of those had really violent tendencies towards women. So you're thinking like choking, spanking, like degrading messaging, sexualization, stuff like that. And that's just like the norm. So if young boys are watching porn where there's no consent conversations, there's no safe sex conversations, and then the men are choking the women.
At 9.
At 9, how do you think that those behaviors are going to like affect their understanding of the world and how they treat women and sex? Like it's that, and that's why, another generalization, but that's why we have things like, you know, sexual violence culture in Australia is so bad. It's because like young men are watching these behaviors play out from such an early age that they think it's so normalized to degrade and treat women this way that they think it's normal to like choke a girl without asking first, you know?
Yeah.
So I think about this all the time. Like what are the things that are affecting our culture if you go from such a young age? And it's just access to all of these really kind of quite dangerous, sexualized things in videos without anyone to have conversations with them about it.
Yeah. I was going to ask later, but since it's just on topic, porn, what is your opinion, I suppose, regarding porn? Because I do hear mixed takes from professionals in the space.
Yeah.
Some people think it's the worst thing of ever.
Yeah.
And probably less, but I do hear some opinions that no, it has a place.
Yeah.
It can be misused, but it does have a place.
I personally think it totally has a place. I'm like very pro porn. I think that the thing that we need to be critical about is the type of porn we're watching and where it's coming from. So there's lots of ethical porn sites you can watch. I think it's more so now being aware of where you're getting your porn from. So if you're, you know, watching a porn site like YouPorn or RedTube or whatever that doesn't teach consent, has lots of violence, doesn't pay their porn stars well, that's things, there's lots of like, you know, I don't know, there's lots of like underage porn and like things that are like super illegal. That's the kind of sites where I'm like, you should be really conscious of what you're watching. If you go to ethical porn sites that treat and pay their porn stars well, you watch the consent conversations happen, there's lots of like sex safe practices involved. They're the ones that I'm like, oh, I actually love that. I think there's totally a place for porn. I think we just have to be conscious of the type of porn we're consuming now.
Yeah, and I also, on that, I agree, but it also should be cautious of age, because I don't know if
100%.
At the age like 9,
oh my God,
all the way through to, I don't know, maybe 15.
Yeah.
I would say probably like none would be what you need as you're beginning to form these views.
Yeah.
And then once they're formed and you understand, you know, that's not real and that might be exaggerated, and there's not the chance of escalation.
Yeah.
Because I was reading about how a lot of kids, they begin with, I suppose, I don't know what you'd call normal porn, but just sort of very tame porn as much as it can be. And then they begin at such a young age, and then and then they get so used to it
and desensitized
to it, and then they escalate to the next thing and the next thing, and eventually you start to get to the really sort of red zone stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially all that will turn them on.
Yeah.
Which is super dangerous.
Totally. And I think that that's the issue with not having good sex ed, is like you need to be able to talk to these kids about what they're seeing and how they can critically analyze what they're watching and break it down and understand things like consent and safe sex and just like all of the nuances and gray areas of having sex. Like it's just, you know, there's so many things like sexual intelligence we don't really teach.
No.
Growing up, how to have those conversations, what sexual well-being is, like verbal, non-verbal, body language in terms of consent, you know, all of these things. It's like we just know that kids are going to watch it. It is so easy to find.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know. I don't want to say like they, because I don't know who they are in terms of controlling it. But I feel like everyone's just sort of closing their eyes and saying, no, it's not happening. But like we all know it's happening.
It's all happening.
Like we all know that kids are going to watch porn.
100%.
And we all know that at some point kids are going to learn about sex before they get to sex ed or fucking mediocre.
Yeah, mediocre. That's crazy.
I know. I don't know whether you knew that or not, but there you go.
God is in the sheets. Problematic.
And I was also going to say, I had no idea about this, but you mentioned about how the curriculum for sex ed is so poor. In America, only 17 states legally require sex ed to be medically accurate.
Yeah. No, it's ridiculous. And a lot of Christian schools as well, like the very religious parts, get to dictate. I mean, they teach abstinence, right? So they teach like, don't have sex. If you have sex, you die kind of vibes. Or if you have sex, you're a slut and you're going to.
That's tad drastic.
Yeah. So they can fully dictate what they teach, and they teach the wrong thing. There's schools in Sydney. There was something recently that came out. It was I can't remember the religion of the school. I don't think it was Christian. It could have been. It was something. Maybe it was Anglican. And they were teaching kids something about like if you have sex, you get holes in your brain, you know? And then it came out.
In Sydney?
Yeah, recently. Like it's insane. It's just crazy that...
That's crazy. Wait.
Yeah, legally until recently, schools can just teach whatever they want. It's really dangerous.
Which is super odd because it is like every subject is so regulated. And every subject is like you do A, B, C, and D, and you don't, and like that is what you teach. But then with sex ed, it's just almost like a free for all, and it's like whatever your personal point of view is, that's what you can teach.
Yeah,
and that just seems so odd.
It's so odd, and also a lot of the time, like I personally believe that sex ed should be its own subject, like maths, right? Like I think it should be something that is taught at least weekly. There's so many conversations to have. Like it needs to be more normalized, and it needs to be taught by professionals that are sex positive, understand their stuff in the space, because a lot of the time the teachers it's like the maths teacher that's coming in and who's subbing in, who doesn't want to do it, who's uncomfortable about it. You can tell the teacher's uncomfortable, therefore you're uncomfortable. Like they're putting their own personal attitudes and values and bias in it.
Worse than math, ours was our religion teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Literally.
That's how it worked.
Right?
And it was a section of religion.
It's so crazy to me that is like allowed and accepted, and it's just starting to change now. A lot of the time schools are hiring external bodies like what I used to go on and do because they were like, we just want someone that is a professional to come and do that. But a lot of schools still don't.
And I know you said you stepped away from doing that kind of role because it was so frustrating, or maybe not frustrating is that the right word, but because it was so outdated and it was
I didn't like the red tape. I didn't like the red tape. I didn't like being so like barriered into what I could talk about. And I just personally like working with adults more. I find it more engaging for me to work work with adults that have like their own social and sexual intelligence and be able to like level with people. Like I really enjoy that.
100%. What I was going to say was, do you not feel like maybe you could make an impact in that space in it? Even though as frustrating as it might be, I don't know the system, but is there a capacity being in the role that slowly over time you'll be able to have an impact?
Yeah, I think that I was actually thinking about this morning. One of my best friends also works in the consent space, and she was going off to watch a guy that teaches consent to all boys schools. And we were having this conversation about what it's going to be like for her to watch a guy come in and talk about consent, which is amazing. And I don't know. Yeah, I think I'd love to go back and be able to work with schools in some capacity. I think that it's taken me so long to come back to that point. It's been like a few years since I've done that. So it's definitely something I want to get back into. You do make the biggest impact with young people, you know?
Yeah.
But I'm also like, there are so many amazing people doing amazing things for young people. Where's their education for adults? Because a lot of people, I don't know, I feel like you get to a certain age as an adult and you just stop trying to engage in sexual education. And there's a huge gap of knowledge and understanding for adults. So I'm really interested in working in that space.
And as adults, not only do you have pretty formed ideas, you also, there's two other is that you don't feel like you need to learn, and physiologically, as it becomes harder to learn, the sections of the brain for learning shrink as you get older. So when you're 30, 40, 50, if you have this set in stone notion about sex and relationships, it's very unlikely for a drastic change.
It's a lot harder to crack for sure. Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I think it's slowly changing. I think that now that we're moving into more of a sex positive sphere, people are becoming more open-minded. But you're right, once you hit like the 40, 50, 60 mark, like the boomers are probably the hardest ones to kind of like talk to. Yeah, totally. Like even, just like classic family members saying like sexist comments. I remember having a conversation with a family member and being like, that's really sexist, you can't say that. And they were just like, it didn't get through to them. And I was like, it's actually crazy that you can't have a conversation with me about it. Yeah, it's interesting, but it's important, you know, it's important to try and crack people that way.
Yeah, the education is super important, and it's becoming more and more evident how badly we're doing it.
We're doing it terribly. We're not doing great. We're not doing great.
It hit me when I moved away for a while and lived with, and I had a lot of my friends who I was with were backpackers and travelers from overseas, and it hit me. I was like, they just see it so differently, and their outlook and opinion on it is so different. It's so open.
I know.
Do you think it's almost as if it's almost like we're in this sort of puritanical society regarding sex, in that, we talk about, it's almost like people sit on a moral high ground and say, we don't talk about that. But it's like, okay, but we'll talk about drugs, and we'll talk about we'll talk about guns, or these things that you probably shouldn't be talking about as much.
Yeah.
And we all know that sex is happening. We all know that everyone's thinking about it, and it's not a bad thing. But it's like and again, I don't know who they is, but it's like we as a society sit on this sort of moral high ground of like, no, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And it's like, why?
It's like an elitist kind of thing, right? It's elitist, it's classist, but it's just so shame-based. It's like we're just taught that if we talk about it, we're either deemed like slutty, or it's inappropriate, or it's, not classy. But I think the total opposite. I think being able to engage in conversations critically about sex and like dissect and talk about things that we've potentially been taught, or even things like sexual communication, sexual intelligence, I think that shows incredible intelligence and growth. Like, I love having these kind of conversations.
Yeah. Why is it the shame-based sort of teachings? Do you think that maybe that's a factor as to why, statistically speaking, and from what I can tell, this generation is having less sex than ever?
Yeah. Oh my God. I love thinking about this. I was thinking about this the other day as well. I think that COVID had a